The call came to Barry Goldwater's Phoenix home at 3:17 a.m. on the 28th of April, 1957, jarring him from restless sleep with news that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the Cold War, McCarthyism, and the true nature of Soviet infiltration in America. The voice on the other end belonged to Roy Cohn, Senator Joseph McCarthy's former chief counsel. And the desperation in his tone made clear that this was no ordinary political emergency. "Senator Goldwater," Cohn whispered urgently, "Joe is dying, and he needs to see you immediately. He has something to tell you about the real communist conspiracy, something that will change everything you think you know about the last 5 years." 3 hours later, Goldwater was on a plane to Bethesda Naval Hospital, carrying with him questions that demanded answers and a growing sense of dread about what McCarthy's final confession might reveal. Think you know the real story of McCarthyism and communist infiltration in America? Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what Joe McCarthy revealed on his deathbed will shock you. Tell me in the comments, were the real Soviet agents hiding in plain sight all along? Let's uncover the truth they buried with McCarthy. Barry Goldwater had known Joseph McCarthy for nearly a decade, had watched him rise from obscure Wisconsin senator to the most feared man in Washington, and had witnessed his spectacular fall from grace following the Army McCarthy hearings. Throughout McCarthy's crusade against communist infiltration in government, Goldwater had maintained an uncomfortable relationship with both the man and his methods, supporting the goal of rooting out communist influence while growing increasingly concerned about McCarthy's reckless accusations and inflammatory rhetoric. Now, as Goldwater's plane descended toward Washington, in the gray dawn light of April 29th, he wondered what final secrets the dying senator might reveal. McCarthy had spent 5 years claiming that communist agents had infiltrated every level of American government, from the State Department to the Pentagon to Hollywood. His investigations had destroyed careers, shattered lives, and ultimately consumed his own political future when his methods were exposed as fundamentally flawed. But what if McCarthy's failure wasn't incompetence or paranoia? What if there was something else, something that would explain why his highly publicized investigations had consistently failed to expose any genuine Soviet agents, while creating enough noise and controversy to discredit the entire anti-communist cause? The Bethesda Naval Hospital psychiatric wing was shrouded in morning mist as Goldwater arrived, his senatorial credentials providing access to the secure floor where McCarthy lay dying from the hepatitis that would claim his life within days. The hallways were eerily quiet, patrolled by naval security personnel who understood they were protecting secrets that could reshape American understanding of the Cold War. Roy Cohn met Goldwater outside McCarthy's private room, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious fear and exhaustion. "Senator," Cohn said in hushed tones, "what Joe is about to tell you will sound impossible, but I've verified every detail. The communist infiltration we spent 5 years investigating was real, but we were looking in all the wrong places." Goldwater entered the dimly lit hospital room to find Joseph McCarthy propped up in bed, his once powerful frame ravaged by disease, but his eyes still burning with the intensity that had made him famous. The man who had terrified Washington with his accusations of communist conspiracy looked like a broken shell, but his voice carried the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out. "Barry," McCarthy said weakly, "thank God you came. I don't have long, and there are things you need to know, things that will explain why everything we did was wrong, why every investigation failed, why every communist we thought we found turned out to be innocent." Goldwater pulled a chair close to McCarthy's bedside, preparing himself for what he sensed would be one of the most shocking conversations of his political career. "Joe, just tell me what you know." Roy said, "You have information about real communist infiltration?" McCarthy's response came in whispered words that seemed to carry the weight of 5 years of failure and betrayal. "Barry, we were played. Every investigation, every hearing, every accusation, it was all orchestrated to protect the real Soviet agents by discrediting anyone who tried to expose communist infiltration." The words hit Goldwater like a physical blow. McCarthy was suggesting that his entire anti-communist crusade had been manipulated by the very forces he claimed to be fighting, that his investigations had been used as a cover to protect genuine Soviet agents while destroying innocent Americans whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "That's impossible, Joe," Goldwater said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had always wondered how McCarthy could be so consistently wrong about specific individuals while being so certain about the general threat of communist infiltration. McCarthy reached into his bedside table and withdrew a manila envelope that contained what he claimed was proof of the conspiracy he had unknowingly served. "Barry, everything's in here. Names, dates, operations, the whole network. The real Soviet agents have been hiding in plain sight for decades, and my investigations gave them perfect cover by making anyone who talked about communist infiltration look like a paranoid fool." Goldwater opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding documents that would challenge everything he thought he understood about Cold War espionage and American security. The first document was a letter written on Kremlin stationery and dated the 15th of March, 1950, nearly 3 months before McCarthy's famous Wheeling, West Virginia speech that launched his anti-communist crusade. The letter, written in English and signed by someone identified only as Control, outlined a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to use an unwitting American politician to discredit legitimate anti-communist investigations. "Subject shows potential for useful misdirection," the letter noted. "His passion for anti-communist cause can be channeled toward harmless targets while protecting genuine assets. Recommend support for his political ambitions while ensuring his investigations focus on ideologically sympathetic but operationally worthless individuals." The implications were staggering. Soviet intelligence had apparently identified McCarthy as the perfect useful idiot, a genuine anti-communist who could be manipulated into investigating innocent people while ignoring real threats. By feeding him false information and encouraging his most outrageous accusations, they had turned America's most prominent communist hunter into an unwitting protector of actual Soviet agents. "Jesus Christ, Joe," Goldwater whispered. "Are you telling me the Soviets were controlling your investigations?" McCarthy's reply revealed the depth of his final understanding and the agony of his realization. "Not controlling, Barry, misdirecting. They fed me just enough real information to keep me convinced I was on the right track, but always about people who weren't actually working for them. Meanwhile, the real agents continued their work, protected by the assumption that if they were genuine threats, the great Joe McCarthy would have found them." The second document in the envelope was even more disturbing, a comprehensive list of actual Soviet agents who had operated in American government during McCarthy's crusade, complete with their positions, their handlers, and their intelligence activities. None of the names appeared on any of McCarthy's target lists. None had been investigated during his hearings. Many had been protected by the very controversy that surrounded McCarthy's methods. Goldwater studied the list with growing horror, recognizing names of individuals who had held sensitive positions in the State Department, the Pentagon, and even the White House during the Truman and early Eisenhower administrations. These were not Hollywood screenwriters or low-level government clerks. They were people with access to genuine state secrets who had used McCarthy's misdirected investigations as cover for their espionage activities. "How long have you known this?" Goldwater demanded. McCarthy's answer revealed the tragic irony of his situation. "I started putting it together after the Army hearings, when I realized that every person I had accused was eventually cleared while real security problems continued to surface in areas I had never investigated. But I didn't have proof until 6 months ago, when one of my old sources came forward with documents that showed how I had been manipulated." The dying senator continued with obvious pain. "Barry, the worst part is that I was so convinced of my own righteousness, so certain that I was saving America from communist infiltration, that I never questioned why my investigations were so consistently wrong about specific individuals. I thought I was fighting communism, but I was actually serving it." Goldwater struggled to process the magnitude of what McCarthy was revealing. If the documents were genuine, they suggested that one of the most significant political phenomena of the 1,950 seconds had been orchestrated by Soviet intelligence as a disinformation campaign. McCarthyism had not been a misguided but patriotic attempt to root out communist influence. It had been a sophisticated enemy operation designed to protect real communist agents while discrediting legitimate anti-communist efforts. "Who else knows about this?" Goldwater asked. "You, me, Roy, and the source who provided the documents," McCarthy replied. "And Barry, we can't let this information become public." If Americans learn that the entire McCarthy era was a Soviet disinformation operation, it will destroy faith in our intelligence services and convince people that communist infiltration is impossible to detect. The damage to national security would be incalculable. The request placed Goldwater in an impossible position. McCarthy was asking him to bury evidence of the most successful Soviet intelligence operation in American history, to participate in a cover-up that would protect national security by hiding the truth about American vulnerability to foreign manipulation. But Goldwater also understood McCarthy's logic. If the American people learned that their own government had been manipulated so completely by Soviet intelligence, if they discovered that the most prominent anti-communist crusade in American history had actually served communist interests, the psychological damage might be worse than the security breaches that would be revealed. The third document in the envelope was a detailed analysis of how the Soviet disinformation campaign had been implemented, written by what appeared to be an American intelligence analyst who had been investigating McCarthy's sources and methods. The analysis revealed a level of sophistication in Soviet psychological warfare that exceeded anything Goldwater had imagined possible. The operation succeeded, the analysis concluded, because it exploited subjects' genuine patriotic convictions while misdirecting them toward harmless targets. By feeding subject accurate but incomplete information about communist infiltration, Soviet intelligence was able to convince him that he was conducting effective counterintelligence while actually protecting their most valuable assets. The document continued with operational details that revealed the full scope of Soviet manipulation. Subjects' investigations were consistently steered away from genuine threats through carefully planted evidence, false witnesses, and misdirection about the nature and location of Soviet intelligence activities. Meanwhile, subjects' public accusations against innocent individuals created enough controversy to discredit legitimate anti-communist efforts and convince moderate Americans that concerns about communist infiltration were paranoid delusions. Goldwater set down the documents and stared at McCarthy's ravaged face, trying to comprehend the implications of what he had learned. If these documents were accurate, then American democracy had been subjected to a form of psychological warfare that was more sophisticated and more damaging than conventional espionage. Soviet intelligence had not merely stolen American secrets, they had manipulated American political processes to protect their operations while discrediting their opponents. "Joe," Goldwater said slowly, "if this is true, then we need to warn people about Soviet disinformation capabilities. We need to ensure that this kind of manipulation never happens again." McCarthy's response revealed the depth of his despair and the complexity of the situation. "Barry, that's exactly what they're counting on. If we expose this operation, we'll convince Americans that they can't trust their own judgment about communist threats. We'll create so much confusion and paranoia that genuine anti-communist efforts will become impossible." The dying senator continued with a final warning that would haunt Goldwater for the rest of his career. "The Soviets didn't just use me to protect their agents, Barry. They used me to poison the entire well of anti-communist sentiment. They turned legitimate concern about communist infiltration into a political weapon that destroyed innocent people and discredited valid security concerns. If we expose how they did it, we'll complete their operation by convincing Americans that any concern about communist influence is automatically suspect." Goldwater understood the dilemma that McCarthy was presenting. Exposing Soviet manipulation would serve the cause of truth, but might damage national security by making Americans too skeptical of legitimate warnings about foreign influence. Bearing the information would protect national security, but would also protect the very disinformation techniques that had made the manipulation possible. As McCarthy grew weaker, he made one final request that would define Goldwater's approach to anti-communist politics for the remainder of his career. Barry, I'm asking you to learn from my mistakes without revealing them. Use this knowledge to conduct real anti-communist efforts that focus on actual threats rather than convenient targets. But don't destroy Americans' faith in their ability to detect and resist foreign influence. The request was both simple and impossible. Continue the fight against communist infiltration using knowledge that could not be shared. Protect American democracy from foreign manipulation without revealing how that manipulation had already succeeded. Restore credibility to anti-communist efforts without exposing how those efforts had been compromised. McCarthy died 3 days later, taking with him the secrets that Goldwater now carried alone. The official cause of death was listed as hepatitis, but Goldwater understood that the real cause was the weight of knowledge that no patriot should have to bear the discovery that his life's work had served the enemy he thought he was fighting. Over the following months, Goldwater struggled with the decision of what to do with McCarthy's final confession. The documents remained locked in his office safe, containing information that could reshape American understanding of Cold War espionage, but that might also damage American security if revealed. The burden of secret knowledge weighed heavily on a man who had built his career on speaking uncomfortable truths. Gradually, Goldwater developed an approach to anti-communist politics that reflected McCarthy's warnings without revealing their source. He focused on policy issues rather than personnel accusations, emphasized the ideological threat of communist expansion rather than the presence of communist agents, and worked to restore credibility to conservative anti-communist arguments by avoiding the inflammatory rhetoric and reckless accusations that had characterized McCarthyism. The knowledge of Soviet disinformation capabilities influenced Goldwater's approach to every major Cold War issue for the remainder of his career. When he evaluated intelligence reports, he considered the possibility of deliberate misinformation. When he assessed political developments, he examined them for signs of foreign manipulation. When he made public statements about communist threats, he chose his words carefully to avoid providing opportunities for future disinformation campaigns. But Goldwater also carried with him the frustrating knowledge that he could not warn other Americans about disinformation techniques that had already been used successfully against American democracy. He could not reveal how Soviet intelligence had manipulated American political processes without undermining faith in American institutions and creating the very confusion that would make future manipulation more likely. Years later, as the Cold War evolved and new forms of foreign influence became apparent, Goldwater would remember McCarthy's deathbed confession as a warning about the vulnerability of democratic societies to psychological manipulation. The Soviet Union had discovered that it was more effective to manipulate American political processes than to steal American secrets, more valuable to discredit American institutions than to infiltrate them. The documents that McCarthy had given him remained classified, not by government decree, but by Goldwater's own recognition that some truths were too dangerous to reveal. The American people needed to understand the threat of foreign influence, but they also needed to maintain faith in their ability to resist that influence. Revealing how completely they had been manipulated might destroy the confidence necessary for effective resistance. In 1987, as Goldwater prepared to retire from the Senate, he made a final decision about McCarthy's confession. The documents were destroyed, their secrets taken to the grave rather than revealed to historians or intelligence analysts. Goldwater had concluded that the knowledge they contained was more dangerous than valuable, that exposing Soviet disinformation techniques would cause more damage than the techniques themselves had inflicted. The decision reflected Goldwater's mature understanding of the relationship between truth and security in a democratic society. Some truths served the public interest by informing democratic debate and holding officials accountable. Other truths served enemy interests by undermining public confidence and creating opportunities for further manipulation. The challenge for democratic leaders was distinguishing between truths that strengthened democracy and truths that weakened it. McCarthy's deathbed confession remained one of the most significant untold stories of the Cold War, a revelation that could have reshaped American understanding of Soviet intelligence operations and the vulnerability of democratic institutions to foreign manipulation. But it also remained a reminder that patriotic service sometimes required carrying burdens that could not be shared, protecting secrets that served the national interest even when revelation would serve the cause of truth. Barry Goldwater's decision to bury McCarthy's confession represented more than a choice about classified information. It represented a recognition that democratic leadership required wisdom about when truth served democratic purposes and when it served enemy interests. In a world where information itself had become a weapon of warfare, the responsibility of democratic leaders included protecting their societies from truths that would make them more vulnerable to future attacks. The real communist conspiracy that McCarthy had finally discovered was not a network of agents stealing secrets, but a disinformation campaign that had used America's own anti-communist sentiment as a weapon against American security. The conspiracy's greatest success was not in protecting Soviet agents, but in discrediting the very idea that America could be vulnerable to foreign manipulation. Goldwater's lifelong burden was knowing how that manipulation had worked while being unable to warn others about its methods. He could only hope that future generations would develop the wisdom to resist foreign influence without falling victim to the paranoia and mistrust that made such influence possible. The price of liberty, he had learned, was not just eternal vigilance, it was the wisdom to distinguish between vigilance that protected freedom and vigilance that destroyed it. In the end, McCarthy's deathbed confession revealed that the greatest threat to American security was not foreign agents operating in secret, but foreign ideas operating in public disinformation campaigns that used American values and American fears as weapons against American interests. The defense against such campaigns required not just intelligence and security measures, but the preservation of democratic institutions and democratic confidence that made resistance possible. Barry Goldwater carried that understanding with him for 30 years after McCarthy's death, using it to guide his approach to Cold War politics while never revealing its source. The senator, who had been known for speaking uncomfortable truths, had learned that some truths were too uncomfortable for democracy to bear, and that patriotic service sometimes required silence rather than revelation. The McCarthy files died with their keeper, but their lessons lived on in the approach that Goldwater and other conservative leaders took to Cold War challenges. They had learned to fight foreign influence without falling victim to foreign manipulation, to resist enemy operations without destroying the democratic institutions that made resistance worthwhile. It was perhaps the most important lesson of the Cold War, that in a battle for democracy's survival, the greatest victory was preserving democracy's essential character while successfully resisting those who would destroy it. Joe McCarthy's final confession had taught Barry Goldwater that sometimes the most patriotic thing a leader could do was carry secrets that protected the very democracy they had sworn to defend.